So this evening, like I said, we turn to back to 2 Samuel. Excuse me, not 1 Samuel. I'm still looking at the answers from 1 Samuel. We don't need those tonight. We're looking into 2 Samuel. We got about 7 chapters in. I went back and legitimately rewatched what we did last time to make sure I was on the same spot, knew where to pick up, knew where we left off, and we really only got through chapter 7. I blurted some stuff out there at the end of chapter 7 about like 8 and 9, but that wasn't fair to those chapters. So we're going to pick up in chapter 7, and as we go there, as we turn there, can anyone remind me who the central figure of 2 Samuel is about? Who is the central figure of 2 Samuel? David. That's right. David was the central figure of 2 Samuel. It's who the book focuses on. This is the life and reign of David. You can kind of conclude it like that. And we started, major unit 1 was the reign of David begins. It talks about how he lamented over Saul, how he was anointed of king over Judah first. If you remember, only Judah recognized him properly as king. And then after some time, the rest of Israel did too in chapter 5. After chapter 5, or in chapter 5 on into chapter 6, he returns the ark back to Jerusalem after it was taken captive by the Philistines. The Philistines quickly realized they did not want it. Ask our VBS kids about what happened to those folks from the Philistines. And then we get to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a crucial part of David's story. It's a crucial part of the Old Testament because in chapter 7, we get God's covenant with David. That's a major issue. He reveals to David that he will honor him in the same lineage that he has honored Abraham. He's honored Jacob, or you can include Isaac in there for a hot cup of coffee. But he honored Abraham, he honored Jacob, and he's telling David essentially, I'm going to honor you as I have them. That out of you I will make a great nation. He said, you will have a kingship that will never end. You will have a reign, a throne that will never end. And we concluded last time that at one point people may have looked at Solomon and went, this is it, but it really wasn't it. But the first half of chapter 7 was David receiving that covenant. And this is where we get to this kind of comparison game. The first half of 2 Samuel was David receiving the blessings of the Lord and David's responses to it. And chapter 7 is a great example of it because the first half of 7 was David receiving that promise, that covenant, and the second half of chapter 7 was David's response to it. It was a prayer of David saying, like, who am I? I love how he starts his prayer. He said, who am I, Lord? And what have I done? What has my family done that has deserved this blessing? And that's the heart of a man after God, right? David was called a man after God's own heart. Here he's showing it. He's saying, who am I? Who am I that is worthy of this blessing? Who am I that should receive what you're willing to give out? And he goes on to pray and say, Lord, like he points everything back to God. He gives all that glory to the Lord. And so we see in chapter 7, he's given this covenant, he's given this opportunity to showcase faith. He's given this opportunity to respond in gratitude, and he does. And in the next chapter, in chapter 8, we see David being victorious and having military success. He goes out and go through this list. He has a war with the Philistines that he wins. He has a war with the Moabites that he wins. He has a war with Zobah around the region of the Euphrates. He regains, as the scripture put, his authority over the Euphrates by conquering not one but 2 different kings of Zobah. He then has these skirmishes with the Arameans out of Damascus. So we can call them Syrian if you want, but they're not quite yet. They're Arameans, Arameans, Arameans. They're important because I want you to note, in chapter 8, he landslide victory defeats them, okay? Not only them, but it mentions the Ammonites and the Amalekites, also David being victorious. This is all of chapter 8. Pretty much, David had enemies, and then David beat those enemies. It ends in chapter 8. The last few verses is just an announcement of his officials, those who he helped put in government. This is, again, appropriate leadership. He's not king over everything. He is king over everything, but he's not fingers on everything. He puts Joab, a man that we should remember because there's been a lot of passages about Joab so far. He puts Joab as the captain over his army. And Joab's reputation goes up before him. That's the type of guy you want leading an army. He's ruthless, he's vicious, he will do what's necessary to win. And you actually see that later on in chapter 10. He's a great captain of the army. Maybe not the guy you want to make mad, but he's a great captain for the army. Zadok and Ahimelech, they are the priests. There's a lot to go there. We're not tonight. But Zadok and Ahimelech, they are the priest. And then another fellow that you would probably want to remember his name, Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, is the captain over the Kerethites and the Pelethites, two special people groups that were kind of to the part, and that takes other history as well. So that's how this ends. You meet David, you see him being victorious, you see him receiving the blessing of the Lord in chapter 7, being grateful, being humble, and then you see in chapter 8 military success. You see him receiving more blessings. Well, chapter 9 is another test. And just to read the highlight of that, he essentially asks, is there anyone else left from the house of Saul? Does he have any kids or grandkids left? Because if we remember the relationship that he had with Saul, at one point he looked at Saul as a father figure. Yes, he was the son of Jesse from the house of Jesse. That was never taken away. But at one point, his relationship with Saul was like father and son. And him with Jonathan, Saul's actual son, they were tight-knit together. They were not blood brothers, but they might as well have been. They had a unique relationship, and they were tied together permanently. Jonathan and Saul were both killed. A lot of other people from Saul's family was killed. And David said, is there any left? And they said, there's one, Mephibosheth. I kind of went out of order last time. I talked about him in a different chapter. No, this is actually Mephibosheth's chapter. What was wrong with Mephibosheth? Does anyone remember? He was crippled. When they were trying to flee at a different point and the nurse dropped him, he became, quote, lame in the feet. More than likely, he just had broken feet or broken ankles or something like that, and it didn't heal correctly, so he couldn't move his feet or use his feet normally. That's as much as we get from Scripture, just lame in the feet. So they say, yes, Mephibosheth is still alive. He should bring him here. And we're going to pick up in chapter 9, verse 6. I want to read a few verses to you. In chapter 9, verse 6, it says, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, I love the clarity, came to David and fell upon his face and bowed down. And that was not due to his crippling. That was him honoring David. David said, Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth's initial response is, I am your servant. Now, okay, we're going to hold on to that. We'll talk about that in just a second. So his response immediately was, I am your servant. Whoa. Sorry, I realized something in front of you, and it's trying not to explode. David said to him, do not be afraid, for I will certainly show you kindness on account of Jonathan your father. I will return to you every field of Saul, your father, and you will eat at my table permanently or perpetually. And then Mephibosheth bowed down. He bowed low and said, what is your servant that you should be concerned for a dead dog like me? That's how Mephibosheth viewed himself. Why? He couldn't work. He couldn't contribute. He couldn't move without the assistance of something or someone. He couldn't go out into the field and cut. He couldn't wait on the table. He couldn't do anything regularly. He viewed himself as worthful or as worthy as a dead dog. And he said, why are you showing me such kindness? Now this, in short, is just a grand illusion. It's David the king showing, and what we're about to see him receive, immaculate grace to Mephibosheth, who's viewed himself as worthless as a dead dog. David responds to this when Mephibosheth says, "This is my position." The king summoned Ziba, his servant, that was the servant of Saul, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all of his house, I have given to the son of your master." Now he's still recognizing, he's saying, Saul was your master. Note how it just said Ziba was his servant. He said, Saul was your master. Everything Saul owns now belongs to him. I have given to the son of your master. You will work for the ground for him. You will work the ground for him, you and your sons and your servants. You will bring in produce so the son of your master will be fed, will have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, the son of your master, will always eat at my table. He called Ziba in and said, look, you were a servant to Saul. You honored him and you served him. This is his grandson. You're now his servant. You and your whole family. As Ziba's point of view, he was just told, one, you're not going to be exiled because you were a servant of a former king. You're not going to be treated harshly because you were a servant of a former king. No. You're going to be set for life. You and your family, your generations have a job. As long as Mephibosheth lives, you have a job. That's job security that anyone would want, right? Not just you. When you get too old to work, guess what? Your kid's got a job. In a culture like in this time, the sweetest gig you could find, right? I'm taken care of. My children are taken care of. Their children are going to be taken care of because we're going to be in servitude to this family as long as they see fit. Unless something crazy happens and David gets mad at us, we're locked in place, which is a beautiful testimony to see how the grace on one person can affect multitudes others. And because you see this list here, later on, it lists that, where did it go? Ziba, he had 15 sons and 20 servants. So all 35 of those, plus Ziba, were given jobs. They were given that security. They were given that provision. They were given that hope in a time that could have been of desperation. But notice, though, he said, Mephibosheth, the son of your master, will always eat at my table. Ziba the king said to the king, everything that my lord the king has commanded to his servant, your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at the table of David like one of the sons of the king. I really want to read that verse for two reasons. One, beautiful. Two, it does validate what I said a couple weeks ago, that David essentially adopted Mephibosheth. Maybe not legally or whatever we jumped through, but he said, you will always dine at my table, which do not have time to go back to Genesis tonight for that, but you see there's such beauty in him saying, he's one of mine now. I'm going to take care of him as if, no problem. Now, this is what I thought of while I was talking to you just now. In the New Testament, where do we hear of a story of a wayward son being brought before the father of a family and being given the position at the table? The prodigal son. That's beautiful, yes. We see this child who was off in the distance, off in the wilderness, off in that foreign land. He was not in the position that he was in. And he said, in a kind of a beautiful parallel, Mephibosheth said, I'm a dead dog. The guy over in the New Testament said, I wouldn't survive unless I ate like a pig. They're these disgusting animals. And then they get brought before, little different circumstances, but they get brought before the father of the family. And they just thought, what's about to happen? They both fall down. Mephibosheth says, I am your servant. The prodigal son said, I'm not worthy to be called your son. Let me just be a servant. And the father both looks at each one of them and says, no, you're going to eat at my table. I don't know what that does for you, but it does a lot for me. This beautiful parallel that when Jesus taught that in the New Testament, those who knew that Jewish history would have remembered that. Just as Mephibosheth could have been exiled, cut off, he was restored. And that was the message that God was trying to bring. I'm not a God of exiling. I'm not a God of throwing out to the wolves. I'm a God of restoration. I want to bring in and give to those who don't deserve it. And this was a test for David. When David was given Mephibosheth, he could have said, nope, that was Saul's. I'm nothing to do with Saul. He's on his own. But he restored to him the land. He restored to him the servants. He restored to him his position. Everything that God was willing to do, David did. And this is where we see David, a man after God's own heart. David was a king of restoration. You say, what about all those enemies? We understand that. We understand he prevailed over the enemies. But here, when David's heart was on display, you saw him saying, I'm going to show grace to the least of these. He cannot work. He cannot serve. He has no ability to contribute, just like us in our salvation. And yet, I'm going to show him the full grace and give him the position of my son at my table. And after chapter 9, after the kindness is displayed, the grace is given, and he showcased the heart of God. Chapter 10, we see the same thing happen. Military success. So chapter 7, chapter 9, God gives him the opportunity to be prideful, gives him the opportunity to be selfish. And David is humble and lowly. He is meek and gentle. And after each one of those opportunities, God says, you have showcased my heart. You will be blessed. You will have utter victory. Even in chapter 10, what it starts out with being, there was the king of the Ammonites. He died. His son or his successor comes into power and gets bad advice because David sends messengers to say, hey, I've heard what's happened in your kingdom. I just want to continue that peaceful relationship with you. Let's not make it awful again. His advisor said, David's trying to trick you. These are spies. They're not just messengers. So he embarrasses the messenger, cuts off half their clothes, cuts off half their beard. David hears about it, says, if that's how you want to be, then there's no way to be other than subjected. So David sends an army. Joab goes out and says, we got this. He displays intelligent military tactics in this chapter. They dominate again. And what's so funny to me about this passage, you see the same people of Aram, the Arameans, come to the aid of the opponent and again get completely conquered and squashed. And actually, this whole chapter ends. From then on, Aram was fearful of further helping the Ammonites. They said, first time, shame on you. Second time, shame on me. There won't be a third time. Now, we're not going to help the enemy of David anymore. And I find beauty in that. But that was chapter 10. David has, again, great success. Oh, but this is when we go downhill. Because Major Unit 3 is the sin and faith of David. This major unit is kind of broken up. You can see it on the screen. And two major sagas, if you want to call them that. First, it's just 2 chapters, 11 and 12. But it's one of the most famous passages in concerning David. It's the saga of Bathsheba. And then from 13 through 20, and yes, 13 through 20 is the saga of Absalom. And then 21 through 24 is the end of David's reign. And I'm not even sure if we'll get to that because let's talk about Bathsheba. David and Bathsheba, there was a time of the year when the kings go out to battle. That's a historical thing. Joab went out. He brought to ruin the Ammonites. He besieged Rabbah, and David yet remained in Jerusalem. We know how the story goes. David wasn't in the battlefield. He was back in Jerusalem. He saw Bathsheba. When he stood down and seen Bathsheba, he said, "Who is that?" They said, "She's married." He said, "I didn't ask if she was married. I said, who is that?" They brought Bathsheba to David. He lay with her. And then the unexpected happened, at least from David's prerogative. She became with child. He said, "What do we do?" He said, "I've got an idea. Let's just get her husband to come in from the battlefield, give him a vacation. He deserves some R&R. Send him home." Uriah was such an upright man. When he came home, he said, "I'm not worthy to be here. I should be out there with everyone else. I am not going home." And David was like, "You're really messing up my plan. I need you to go home." So there's plausible deniability that when it comes to light that Bathsheba is with child, they won't think it's because of me. They will think it's because of you. But he couldn't say that to Uriah. So he was like, "Nah." Uriah eventually goes back out to the battlefield, and David says, "Oh, I've got a new idea. Let's just kill Uriah." So that's what they do. He said, when the battle's hot, when everyone's fighting, everyone else just fall back, leave Uriah out there by himself, and let the enemy take care of that. Now, where have we heard that military strategy before? Oh, yeah, Saul, when he was trying to get David killed. He said, "I'm going to send David over to the Philistines. Surely the Philistines will just get rid of David off my plate and will be a thorn removed from my side." The Philistines didn't kill David, but Uriah lost his life. He fell into battle, and David said, "Whew, problem solved. Bathsheba's now a widow. I'll just bring her into my concubines and let her, be nourished by the king." And then Nathan shows up. And Nathan says, "David, I've got a little story for you. There was this incredibly rich man, had thousands of sheep, right? And there was one poor man who really only had one sheep, loved it like a daughter, David. Stranger came to the rich man's house and said, 'I'm hungry. Can you lodge me and give me some food?' He said, 'Sure.' But he didn't want to pluck a sheep from his own flock to prepare for the poor traveler. So he went and took the one sheep from the man, the poor man, who loved that sheep like a daughter, killed it and served it. What do you think ought to happen to that rich man?" He said, do what we need to. I mean, that's awful. String him up." And that's when Nathan says the famous words, "David, thou art the man. You were the rich man that robbed the poor man." Now, what did we just talk about with David and Mephibosheth? David was the rich man blessing the poor man, showing grace to the poor, lifting up the poor, lifting up the feeble and unable. And now things have completely flipped. And Nathan said, "You are now the rich man that has destroyed the poor man. You have left the heart of God. Your actions have now testified in a completely different way." Nathan told David, "The son that is in the womb of Bathsheba, he shall die." And for 7 days, David prayed. He fasted and he wept and he prayed in order for the Lord to turn his opinion away from the child. Let me not forget to say this. David openly showed repentance. That's a key aspect of David's relationship with the Lord and a key aspect of the heart of David towards God. He openly repented, said, "What do I do?" Nathan said, "Look, this is what's going to happen." David prayed for 7 days, wouldn't eat, just fasted and prayed and wept. When the child passed, he got up, washed his face, and sat down to eat. Confused all of his servants, said, "David, for 7 days you wept. But now that the child is gone, you're not weeping, you're eating. It's almost like you're celebrating." He goes, "Yeah, because for 7 days I didn't know what the Lord would do. But now I do. I cannot bring my child back, but one day I'll go be with him. I can't mourn any longer. I have to mourn. Now I know for certain the will of God." So we go forth. He continued forth. Not only did he mourn, so did Bathsheba, and that's where we see, verse 24 of chapter 12, David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and they tried again. They conceived a son, this time lawfully, legally, and inside the will of God. They named him Solomon, and the Lord loved him. David repented, wept sore before the Lord, and God honored his repentance. After the son had passed, They had a new son, Solomon, and the Lord loved him and blessed Solomon. And we'll get to more of Solomon later on. But unfortunately, this cycle that was, David had faith, he honored God, he was humble, he was meek, he was lowly, he was gentle, and he was blessed, has now shifted to David's sin and the sin of David's family and the tragedies that follow it. Because obviously we've already seen David had sin with Bathsheba, tragedy followed. He repented, and there was blessing. Solomon was born. Well, he has more children through his wives and concubines, and we get more tragedy. Chapter 13, the saga of Absalom. It takes up from 13 through 20, all these chapters, because it's not so cut and dry. And we're going to get into some sticky stuff with this. You thought the Bathsheba stuff was sticky. Amnon and Tamar. Let's talk about them. After this, Absalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister. This is the beginning of chapter 13. Absalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. The way the Bible is saying this is Absalom and Tamar had both David and the same mother as parent, right? Okay? That's important. And Amnon, the son of David, fell in love with her. Now, Amnon is the son of David, but he's Tamar's half-brother. They did not share the same mother. And you can go back in the book and see it. Amnon loved her so much, it literally says here, he was depressed how much he loved her. He was love sick. We've used that term still today. So, in short, he tricked her to come into his room, put all of his servants out, and he took advantage of her. Now, another important part. She had not been given to a husband at this point. She was still a maid in her virginity. There's two ways about going about this according to the law of Moses. Had she accepted Amnon, everything would have been okay. The problem was she did not accept Amnon initially because she wasn't okay with the situation that Amnon presented to her. So much so, she says, Amnon, you did not have to do this. You could have simply asked David for me, and he would have given me to you. But you violently upset what was supposed to be. Now remember, half-brother, half-sister. I know that's weird now. Probably not the strangest thing then, but it's very strange now. We look past that to recognize what happened. She said, had you just done it the right way, everything would have been okay, but this is awful. She went and said, I'm never going to be given then. I've been destroyed. I've been disrupted. Absalom finds out, and like any good brother, wants to kill Amnon. David finds out, and now remember, the law says if they're both compliant, let them be compliant together. But if one was taken advantage of, then there was clarity in the law that the one that took advantage of the other against their consent should be destroyed. David finds out, I can't even fathom this, keeps it quiet. Well, Amnon decides, let me lay low for a while. Absalom finally calms down, and eventually, I don't have all my notes for this. Let's not go over that tonight anyway. All right. yeah, we'll come back to that one. Y'all got a bonus one for this one. Eventually, Absalom goes out and said, hey, I want all my brothers to come have a party with me, essentially. And they were like, okay. And I remember this time it was like Amnon's kind of persona non grata. And Absalom was like, no, even Amnon come, everything's okay. Except it absolutely wasn't. The whole thing was a trick. He wanted Amnon to come, and when he did, he told everyone the plan. It was the worst surprise party for Amnon because it involved him dying. And when he showed up, they killed him, and Absalom was like, finally, this grief that is set on me has been relieved. So he seemed like a champion to his immediate peers because, well, he vindicated his sister. David said, I just lost 2 sons. Not only did I lose Amnon, my actual son, but now Absalom, you've broken my heart. And then Absalom kind of went away for a while. So much so, there was division. Like I said, this took over 2 years to happen, by the way. You see that in verse 23 of chapter 13. After 2 years, Absalom killed Amnon. And he fled. There was just this great tumult. There was this dissension, if you will. He fled and went to Geshur and was there for 3 years. King David longed to go out to see Absalom, for he was consoled over the death of Amnon. So essentially, like, he cried over Amnon. He still remembered what Amnon did and longed to see Absalom. But Absalom went away for 3 years. So this was a 5-year span from the time it happened to the time we get to chapter 14 when Absalom returns to Jerusalem. And let's just go through this quickly. Absalom returned. Chapter 14, David forgave him, which seems great, right? He even finds out in the last few verses of chapter 14, Joab came and reported this to him. Then he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king, bowed low to him, his face on the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So it seems like at the end of 14, everything's hunky-dory. Literally the beginning of verse 15. After this, Absalom acquired for himself a chariot, horses, and 50 men to go before him. Absalom would go early into the stand beside the way of the gate. When any man who would have a dispute concerning, he would come to the king with a judgment approach. Absalom would call to him and say, where are you from? Which city are you from? And would say, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel. Then Absalom would say to him, look, your claim is good and right, but there is no one to hear you on behalf of the king. He would continue, if I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who had a claim could come, and I would give him justice. Absalom, underneath the nose of David, began to build an army, but would go sit into the gate, essentially go sit at the courthouse, and when someone showed up with a dispute, he would say, oh, no one's here to settle that for you today. No one's here to help you. But if I were a judge, I would make sure someone would be here to help you. It was this great political conspiracy. He was literally showing up almost to like the polling booth and saying, hey, if you vote for me, I will make sure you're taken care of. We understand that even today, that's dirty politics. If you just vote for, if I were to be mayor, I'd have this town running ship shape. I would take care of everybody. No one would have to worry about a thing. Eventually, this sort of number of people with Absalom continued to grow. They continued to side with him, so much so that in the middle of 15, we see David actually fleeing from Jerusalem. He's run out by his own son because his son, it was gathering so much people underneath his wings that he essentially conquered David without a battle. David fled. Chapter 16, we find Ziba again. Remember, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth. Ziba, who was given a lifetime job, he and his children. Ziba meets David with a couple of saddle donkeys carrying 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, and summer fruits, wine, made with all this stuff. The king said to Ziba, what do you have, or why do you have it? And he said, the donkeys are for the household of the king to ride. The bread and the summer fruit are for the servants to eat. The wine is for those who may be weary in the wilderness to drink. The king said, and where is your master's son? Ziba said to the king, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, today they will return to me the house of Israel and my father's king. David said, everything that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. And Ziba replied, I bow before you. May I find favor in your sight, my lord and king. So there's this, if you want to call it a chance encounter between David and Ziba, and he kind of just tests him. He's saying, Ziba, are you on my side still? And Ziba said, yes, I am still on your side. And David blesses him. But even though David blessed someone, he meets another person that ends up cursing him. And that was Shimei, son of Gera. You see, like he literally threw stones at David. And that was through the middle of chapter 16. At the end of chapter 16, the advice of Hathahil and Hushai. There's advice given, not good advice. And this continues on into chapter 17, chapter 18. All of this is this constant turmoil around David and Absalom. The end of chapter 17, though, Absalom dies. So let's just pick up in verse 24, and this is where we're close at the end of chapter 17. David came to Mahanaim as Absalom crossed Jordan, he and every Israelite with him. Now Absalom had placed Amasa over the army in the place of Joab. So you see Absalom saying, like, look, not even David's people are safe. I'm taking Joab out, and I'm replacing them with my own. This is something we still see today around the world in kingdoms that still have, or countries that still have kingdoms in places like this. They will take out the previous political regime and replace it with their own. And he did it here. He took out Joab, and he replaced him with Amasa, the son of a man named Jether, the Ishmaelite. Now, who remembers the Ishmaelites? Who was old Ishmael? Abraham's biological son by the handmaid, by the concubine. That was Abraham and Sarah's great idea to bring about the promise of God, right? She said, well, if I can't do it, have my handmaid do it. Well, we should have just waited for the Lord, right? So Ishmael was the son born out of due season, born against the will of God. So let me just repeat that last part. Born against the will of God. Back here, he placed Amasa over the army. Now Amasa was the son of a man named Jether, the man from the lineage that was against the will of God. Let's not get lost on the little details that we can overlook. Who went into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, the sister of Jerusalem, the mother of Joab. Twisted branches there. Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobai, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, and of the Ammonites, Machir, the son of Amiel from Lo-debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought bedding, metal bowls, ceramic vessels, all these things, and he brought them to David. The people were hungry, exhausted, and thirsting in the wilderness, and they were provided for. David mustered up the strength of the people. He dispatched them in verse 2. Verse 3, the people said, you should not go, for if we retreat, they will not be concerned about us. Essentially saying, if we run away, they're not going to chase us. They're going to chase you. You don't need to be near the front. The king said to them, I will do what seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate while all the people went out in hundreds and thousands. The king demanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, deal gently with the young man Absalom. David says to Joab, don't be Joab, essentially. He says, I don't want you to be the harsh man of war that I know you are. When you see my son, go easy. Can y'all figure out where this is about to go before we read it? Verse 9, Absalom was encountered by some of the servants of David. Now Absalom was riding on his mule when the mule went underneath the branches of a very large tree. His hair and his head was caught in the tree. And the donkey walked on, and he was left there hanging in that tree. One man saw him and reported him to Joab, saying, I saw Absalom hanging in the tree. Joab said to the man, what? You saw him? Why did you not strike him on the spot, sending him to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. I would have rewarded you very handsomely. The man said to Joab, not even if I had felt the weight of 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, would I have laid a hand on the king's son. In short, ain't no way I was about to do that. That's David's son, who he clearly said, do not harm. Then Joab said, I will not waste any more time with you. He took 3 spears in his hand and thrust him through the heart of Absalom. This is the same guy that killed the other guy right outside the gate of the city of refuge. His character has not changed. He failed to listen to David time and time again. And now the son that David once lost for 3 years, that was restored to him, but then chased him out of his own kingdom, who he was about to reconcile, at least in his head, with again, was then taken from him again. Because there was no coming back from this. He killed Absalom. And I do appreciate how the scriptures put, while he was still alive in the midst of the tree. Him hanging by the head and the hair was not killing him. Joab did. He struck him in the heart. Then he blew the horn. The people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. Then they took Absalom, disposed of him in a large pit in the forest, piled over him heaps of stone, and all of Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set for himself a memorial stone in the valley of the kings, for he said, I have no son by whom my name may be remembered. So he named the memorial stone after himself, and to this day it's called the monument of Absalom. And that is where we will have to pick up next time. But we see now, like I said, the first half of Samuel, everything's great. Everything's David's way. And the second half of 2 Samuel, David begins to sin, and things begin to go downhill. And sin begins to crop up in his family, and David doesn't address it, and it creates more problem. Because now let's remember, had David enacted the law on Amnon, which would have been hard, Absalom wouldn't have killed Amnon. Absalom would not have fled. Absalom would not have felt that rejection. And when he came back and began to revolt against the king, I don't know every law, but I know that there is laws about the kingship. Absalom should have been dealt with already. But now David is mourning all over again. David did not take care of the sin when it was made known to him of Amnon. And that led to all those chapters we just covered from 13 here through 18. It's led to all of this because David ignored sin. And there's still more to go. Any question or comment before we dismiss?